So thank you. And today I'm delighted to be able to welcome Laetitia Lemaistre, who will be presenting on refugees in urban Jakarta and Bogor. I think it's really interesting to have Laetitia today, because most of the time we hear about education in refugee settings in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Pakistan, and probably in Bangladesh because of the crisis with Rohingyas. And we don't get to hear much about what's happening in sort of Southeast Asia or in Indonesia. So this is an interesting opportunity for us to learn from Laetitia's work. Laetitia is an EdD, Doctor of Education student with us at the Institute of Education within the Center for Education and International Development. She's an education specialist who focuses on refugee education, education in emergencies and conflict contexts, and humanitarian coordination. Laetitia has over 15 years of experience working with different UN agencies, the World Bank, and international non-governmental organizations in East Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. She has a background in international education policy and planning, has an MA from Columbia University Teachers College, and focuses on community-driven development in her work. And as I said at the beginning, Laetitia is currently completing her EdD with us. So the plan for today is that Laetitia will speak for about half an hour about that. Then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. So I will be sharing Laetitia's slides, and if you could let me know when to change your slides, that would be great, Laetitia.
Will do, thank you.
So yeah, over to you.
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I've not been back on campus since 2019, so I've been looking forward to engaging with all of you, and thank you to Jendra for setting this up. I'm Laetitia. As Jendra said, I'm a candidate for the Doctorate of Education, and I'm at the stage of my doctoral journey where I'm wrapping up my data collection, and I'm chest deep in transcription and starting data analysis. I'm currently based in Jakarta in Indonesia. I'm half Indonesian. I grew up here. This is very much home for me. Next slide, please. So the way I'm going to break up the talk, I'll provide an introduction, some contextual situational analysis to the displaced population in Indonesia. I'll introduce my research questions, my research paradigm and methodology. I'll talk a little bit about conducting research during the pandemic, how the pandemic impacted my methodology, my data collection experience, what some of the challenges were, and what some of the surprising advantages were as well. As I said, I'm very early on in the data analysis, so I'll talk briefly about preliminary findings that are coming out of the analysis. And then to wrap it up, I'll talk a little bit about the EdD and Family Life and my own personal experience taking the quote unquote scenic route, as I like to call it. So next slide, please. My research is focusing on refugees' access to education in the capital city, Jakarta, and a neighboring city immediately next to Jakarta called Bogor. So refugees are across the country. Indonesia is an archipelago of 17,000 islands, and you find refugees on all the main islands, but the majority, I would say about 50%, are on the island of Java in Jakarta and Bogor. Indonesia has a relatively small refugee population compared to other countries. We're talking about a displaced population of 14,000 refugees in a country that has over 250 million people. So the country with the fourth largest population in the world. And I argue that Indonesia as a research area for international migration is often overlooked and often understudied. And what's interesting about Indonesia is that it's not a signatory to the 1951 convention. So it is under no obligation to provide social services to refugees and asylum seekers. And often refugees and asylum seekers are not looking to stay in Indonesia. Indonesia is very much regarded as a stop or a transit point along a much longer, often dangerous migratory route to countries such as Australia. And as we know, anecdotally, refugees would often hire smugglers to continue their route to Australia by boat. Australia has retracted its national asylum policies and tightened maritime borders since the early 2000s. And in fact, asylum seekers attempting to enter Australia by boat were often sent to other countries such as Papua New Guinea or Nauru in the South Pacific. They were contracting, if you will, other countries to take in these asylum seekers and refugees who are trying to enter the maritime waters. So as a result, what we find in Indonesia is a displaced population who've been in Indonesia for up to 10 years. And for lack of a better word, they're very much stuck. So much so that an academic that I follow, Ance Misbach, has described Indonesia as the islands of stuckedness. It's in terms of the demographics, the displaced population is majority Hazara ethnic group originally from Afghanistan. But in fact, many of the refugees that I've been speaking to have been living in displacement in Pakistan or Iran, and many were even born in displacement. But as you're all well aware, due to the national shifting policies towards refugees in those countries, and certainly since the events of 2019, resettling to Afghanistan or staying in Pakistan, Iran is not an option. And the other demographics of displaced population, we find Iranians, Somalis, Eritreans, quite a large number of Rohingyas in the northwest of the country in Aceh. So as I said, Indonesia is not a signatory to the convention. They don't need, by humanitarian law, refugee law, to provide social services. And yet, what we find is that the government of Indonesia has made provisions to access formal education for refugees. But the context that I'm studying and that I'm curious about is that the majority of refugees do not enroll in the formal system in Indonesia. And what we find in Indonesia is a dynamic, self-sufficient, self-funded, innovative network of community-based refugee learning centers. And these are examples of non-formal education across Jakarta as well as Bogor. So despite the significant gaps in refugees accessing education, so within the formal system, you only find about 17% of school-aged children, or perhaps because of the significant gaps, what we observe are refugee communities organizing themselves for the provision of education. They have received very limited research attention to this date, but because of the refugees' unique needs, their aspirations are hindered by limited education opportunities. Refugees in Indonesia have established and they deliver what they view as the most relevant education provision for their children. My research is exploring how refugees in Indonesia navigate through a landscape of limited education provision. Refugees in Indonesia are creating educational opportunities for themselves while living in a forced displacement for an unknown period of time. And I'm investigating the perspectives of both education professionals as well as refugee education practitioners who are supporting the learning of refugee children and young people in Indonesia. And I coined these refugee educationalists. I also seek to explore, to question what is best practice, and I use quotation marks around best practice, for refugees as determined by refugees themselves. So to what degree are refugees included in determining what is the promoted global notion of best practice? How does that best reflect the voices, the aspirations of refugee learners? I'm curious as to what is actually best in refugee education when refugees are able to regain control and they're motivated to design and implement their education for their children and young people. Next slide, please. So through this research, I'm seeking to understand refugee educationalists, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that term, what their role is, what their unique skill sets are and their experiences, and how these actors can be better supported. My research question is from the perspective of refugee educationalists and refugees are included in that definition of refugee educationalists. How do refugees respond to the gap in educational provision in Indonesia? My sub-questions are, what are the educational opportunities that are currently available? How do authorities and actors make these opportunities available? What kind of educational provision do refugees prioritize? And finally, how do refugees conceptualize? How do they design and deliver education? Next slide, please. I'm going to talk through briefly some of the conceptual frameworks and literature that are guiding my research. And I'm sure many of you have encountered the same research and authors. I am very drawn to the work of Fraser on economic, political, and cultural justice and how justice is applied to refugee education. So Fraser's three-dimensional model for social justice provides a conceptual lens to education. And then EdD further applies it to the marginalization of refugee learners in an Australian school setting. And in my own research, I'm curious about how issues of economic redistribution, of political representation, of legal and cultural recognition play out. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Novelli, Cardozo, and Smith, their 4Rs framework, building on what Fraser was introducing in terms of recognition, redistribution, representation. They also talk about reconciliation in education. And in my own research, I'm examining how social justice can be promoted through education policies, how social justice is promoted through education practice that disrupt systems, that these systems that perpetuate inequalities in education. And I'll talk a little bit about it later as I'm seeing it in my data analysis, but the reconciliation between refugee educationalist groups in Indonesia. As I'm doing in a doctorate of education, we are required to situate and legitimize the research or our research from the perspective of professional groups. And so I'm very early on in my EdD career, I was introduced to the work of Nordegraf, and it resonated with me very strongly. They write a lot about hybrid professionalism. So I argue that I coined this term refugee educationalists, and I argue that they're hybrid professionals. And basically, it's the merging of professional spheres. So people who have a background in refugee response and humanitarian law, they understand the unique needs of displaced populations, especially those in protracted displacement, especially those who might be in urban refugee contexts. And it's the merging with a background in education, in how you meet the very unique, specific education needs of refugee populations. So keeping in mind that refugee children and young people are likely to have spent multiple years out of a formal system. And oftentimes, people who have this hybrid professional background, they understand there is a need for flexible, for age-appropriate programs to be designed to facilitate refugee children and young people's entry into the national system, if that's what they choose, or if they seek out certified education, for example. And other pieces of writing that I've been quite drawn to is Exercising Agency in Refugee Education, HAZE. So looking at how refugees in Indonesia are exercising agency by establishing alternative education, by making conscious choices to conceptualize, to create, to deliver a bottom-up approach to education. I've also been drawn to the work of Moselson, who writes about education as raison d'être, as portable capital in forced displacement. She works with adolescent Bosnian refugees in New York City, demonstrating the great importance that's placed on education by refugees in their country of resettlement. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Sarah Dryden Peterson's work. She's written encyclopedias on refugee education. But one argument or one piece of writing of hers that I'm really drawn to is the future-oriented aspirations of refugee families. It's really useful for me to refer to this particular research because education becomes an instrument to conceptualize, to recreate futures for families in protracted displacement. So it's education as raison d'être, it's education as portable capital, and it's education as a future-oriented aspiration, as a hope, which becomes really apparent for me in this current context and at this stage of my research. Just to add here that refugees are reclaiming agency in Indonesia when they are establishing refugee learning centers. Jakarta is an extremely challenging, dense city of 20 million people, and refugees have chosen not to enroll their children into the formal system, but rather to prepare themselves, to prepare their children with an education that they believe they will need for their future, rather than the education that's prescribed for them in the Indonesian national education system. And remember, this is in the context of the islands of stuckedness. There's no timeline, there's no sense of when they will leave Indonesia to be resettled. Next slide, please. So this qualitative research adopts social constructivist, interpretivist perspectives. I'm seeking to glean meaning from the truths, from the realities of a very diverse range of research participants. And as a qualitative researcher, I'm drawn to what I argue is a phenomenon of community-driven refugee education in Indonesia, and how refugee educationalists, including refugees, work with urban refugees in Jakarta to construct and to interpret meaning of their world. I'm mainly using semi-structured interviews with refugee educationalists, so those who are working with different UN agencies, with different international and local NGOs, civil society groups, fewer actors in government, because as they're not a signatory, there isn't a government agency that's mandated to support refugee inclusion in healthcare, in social services and education. And so I'm speaking to refugee educationalists, and then also that includes refugee education practitioners. And these are educationalists who are working within the community centers, the community-led refugee learning centers. These are women and men who are not only educators, but they're also students themselves who might be pursuing their high school degrees. They might be pursuing a university degree, running different refugee-led initiatives. They may be parents of students or community representatives. And I'm arguing that they're very much determiners of their own learning, of their own future, that they're not passive recipients of humanitarian service, but they're active stakeholders who are conceptualizing, who are designing, who are delivering education to their own communities. And they have mobilized networks and have found significant resources to establish, while they're microsystems, they've established systems of education that believe that they can serve their unique purposes. And so I'm looking at how these refugee communities are conceptualizing a vision of education and then operating their learning centers. Next slide, please. So this section is a little bit about conducting research during the pandemic, as well as how the pandemic impacted my methodology and data experience. I found myself in 2021, like many of you, I'm sure, faced with a number of unusual obstacles in terms of conducting field research. The situation in Indonesia was extremely challenging in regards to the Delta variant. And I was also encountering the issues with my foreigner researcher permit. So I'm actually a French national who's based in Indonesia, and I needed to apply and be granted by the Ministry of Education in Indonesia a foreign researcher permit. I wouldn't have been allowed to conduct any research prior to that. And I was eventually granted the permit, but the restriction is that I could do no research face-to-face, and everything I had to do would be online. So I was then faced with this question of, how do I collect data with refugee learning centers and with different refugee educational organizations during a pandemic? I had met quite a number of people prior to the pandemic, but then found myself in 2021 I had to be quite creative. So I miraculously on Instagram stumbled upon an online conference for urban refugees in Indonesia, just my luck. And it ended up that almost all of the organizations that I would interview, a lot of the participants had been in this 3-day online conference. And that's how I was introduced to this really dynamic network of refugee educationalists. And it's not coincidental, because Indonesia is one of the countries of highest social media per capita usage in the world. WhatsApp, Instagram, Telegram, Discord, Twitter, Facebook, but it's a little outdated these days. You name it, Indonesians use it. And while it can be tricky for a refugee to register a phone, they're able to get connected and they're able to get on these platforms. And I would say that the vast majority of my introductions were actually via Instagram or WhatsApp, and people would respond within a matter of hours, if not minutes in some cases. I think sending a formal email request for an interview would have been utterly pointless, probably not even seen by the recipient. And Zoom, I mean, all the refugee educationalists working with the organizations, with different civil society groups, they were all using their office accounts. All the refugee educators were linked to the community learning centers, and they had spent the better part of the last 2 years teaching online, and they were happy, often intrigued to speak with me online once I would reach out to them on Instagram or WhatsApp. And initially, I was a bit apprehensive about conducting my research online, especially using many of these platforms, but it has worked out. And I think this is going to be a phenomenon for those of us who are doing our data collection in 2021, 2022. I was still able to develop rapport and have more of these personal connections through my online chats and these Zoom calls. And I felt in many ways that participants could speak openly, could speak quite frankly, in these private groups that we had set up. And so that was a surprising advantage for me during this period. Next slide, please. So where am I now? Again, this is preliminary findings that are coming out of my data analysis, and I'll speak briefly to this. I've wrapped up my data collection, and as I said earlier, I'm chest deep in transcription and data analysis, so these are only preliminary findings. But I will go back to some of the conceptual frameworks that I discussed earlier. So in line with Fraser's social justice framework in terms of economic redistribution, political representation, legal, cultural recognition, the reasons refugee children aren't accessing the formal system, so the Indonesian national system of education, includes their limited financial resources, the language barriers that refugee children face because they don't speak Bahasa Indonesia at an adequate level, and oftentimes, and I would say this is the main determinant more than anything, is an unwillingness or a lack of being able to envision on the part of the parents their time protracted in Indonesia. They're unwilling to enroll children in the national system because they see their time in Indonesia as limited before resettlement to another country where a language such as English would be more useful. And just to add that all the community learning centers operate entirely in English. So they're a parallel system that operate in another medium of instruction to the national medium of instruction. And again, these are the islands of stuckedness. It's a time warp for refugees here. They're very likely to stay here for more than 10 years, especially given our global context, and especially different countries' resettlement policies have shifted dramatically. And we know that the access to formal education is allowed by the government of Indonesia, but there are multiple gatekeepers and there are multiple administrative hurdles that make it extremely challenging for refugees to access education. It's not legally binding for refugees to attend the national system. The government of Indonesia doesn't have an enforcing agency to ensure that children are attending. And frankly, I haven't found government representatives that particularly care. We've made the system available for you. And if you choose not to attend, so be it. You can attend your community center. And yet refugees might be in Indonesia for much longer than 10 years. What I'm seeing, what I'm observing is that refugees have demonstrated that they can participate on a par with some of the bigger refugee education players, if you will. These community centers are better organized. They're highly prioritized networks of education that are in high demand. There are long waiting lists to get into some of these centers. They have extremely sophisticated, innovative fundraising mechanisms. They have tapped into diverse funding networks, be it through the church or tapping into diaspora networks, the Eritrean diaspora network in the US, the Afghan diaspora network in Australia, in Europe, in the US. It's really quite remarkable, the partnerships, the networks that they have with certified programs in the US. Even UNHCR globally has recognized one of the refugee learning centers here with an innovation award for the level of sophistication that they demonstrated during the pandemic for online learning, putting, in fact, the Indonesian national education system to shame because the level of digital innovation technology that they demonstrated was really quite remarkable. And And then to go back to Novelli, Cardozo, and Smith, there's a reconciliation by many of the multilateral players here, such as UNHCR, such as the International Organization for Migration, that they are now, I don't want to say forced, but that they now need to recognize many of these refugee learning centers as an equal player, as a critical player. Oftentimes, the position of these agencies is that they must be enrolled, refugee children and young people must be enrolled in national systems. And yet this is not what refugees choose. This is not what refugees prioritize. And they've created a very dynamic system that is participating on a par. And many of these multilateral players need to reconcile and have them sit at the table. What I'm seeing, though, is that oftentimes refugees are still not invited to those government meetings, that they're still not participating. What I imagine will happen over the next few months and years is that more and more refugees will be going to these learning centers, this network of about 12 centers, and that refugees will need to be included at those high-level discussions. In terms of the emergence of other key themes, hope is one word that I hear over and over again, and it links back to the raison d'être, the future-oriented aspiration, supportable capital, that education really provides this sense of hope for for their future life in resettlement, whenever that may be, wherever it may be. Because Indonesia doesn't have a long history of hosting refugees in the formal education system, there is a pretty dramatic lack of different accelerated education options that would provide a flexible, age-appropriate program for refugees. And while the non-formal refugee learning centers are not yet certified, there seems to be, again, preliminary finding, a real prioritization of formal education by refugees. They see the importance of certification. They want to go through a formal curricula. So a lot of these centers are using the Australian national curricula, they're using the Cambridge curricula, the Singaporean government curricula. They want their children to sit through exams. And one final finding that I'll just highlight here because it's quite interesting, refugee learning centers are also targeted by refugees. And this is, again, happening online on the different social media channels that I described to you earlier. But the refugee learning centers are being used as a scapegoat for prolonging displacement in Indonesia. On more than one occasion, participants would mention that the learning centers are being blamed for a delayed resettlement to a third country. Next slide, please. And to conclude, this is my more personalized experience of my EdD journey. And I like to call it taking the scenic route. I started my EdD in 2016, and I was told by the program lead at the time that life happens and that we should be prepared for whatever might happen during the doctorate. And she was right. Life happened in many, many ways. I won't go into all the details, but I moved countries. I ended up doing my upgrade Viva and having a child at the beginning of the pandemic. I am expecting my second child in 2 months. And I should have added, that's another bonus of doing online data collection while being pregnant, is not having to travel across a huge metropolitan area while 7 months pregnant. And needless to say, in many ways, I took that scenic route during my doctorate, and it often felt difficult at times seeing members of my starting cohort finish within the minimum number of years. But I would argue now, with the luxury of 6 years into it, that there has been an advantage for me for taking my time for the EdD. So I had initially been drawn to focus on Greece for many of the same reasons why Indonesia is so intriguing for me. You know, Greece is this transit country for displaced populations, and I started my research for the institutional focus study looking at refugee children's access to education in Athens. And life had other plans for me. I moved home to Indonesia after living abroad for the better part of 17 years. And by chance, I started meeting refugees and other refugee educationalists who are working in Jakarta. And I was intrigued. I was impressed actually by many of the professionals that I was meeting in the field of refugee education. I felt highly motivated to shift my geographic focus to Indonesia from the Mediterranean. And of course, I'm still facing many of the same themes in terms of refugee education, in terms of migratory routes and transit areas and so forth. Just to add that I also had the incredible support of Tejendra and of Elaine Chase, who are my supervisors and who without hesitation said that I should absolutely refocus to Indonesia, that, as I said at the beginning, it's an often overlooked, understudied country for displaced populations and international migration. So at this point, I thank you very much for listening. And I'm curious about any questions or comments or feedback that you would have, and I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Laetitia. That was very thorough, very intriguing, and very educational in many ways, I think. I've got a couple of points. Maybe I should just mention at the beginning before I invite colleagues for their comments and questions. The first point is often when we look at refugee education in different contexts, we observe a lot of hostility against refugee educational provisions by the state, also by the local communities. But you painted a very positive picture where we didn't hear much about the difficulties that Indonesian state would have created for refugees to run their educational centers, the learning centers. I mean, I'm just curious that are they okay with how these learning centers are organized? What is being taught? How do they ensure what is being taught in those centers is unproblematic to the control that the state always wants to have over teaching and learning within their territorial sort of control area? So how does that work in Indonesia? Because in other places we don't see that kind of very accommodative environment. That's first point. The second point for me is that I think this idea of legal and cultural recognition is quite interesting. The 4R framework, Novelli and friends, I don't think they actually imagine refugee context explicitly when they developed this framework. Obviously, a lot of the ideas come from Nancy Fraser's work. But I think the way that you are trying to adapt this framework into the refugee education context is quite intriguing. And I think it would be interesting to see how you elaborate and explain and apply those ideas, and maybe something interesting comes out. And I think legal recognition seems to be an interesting notion in the refugee context, but also the idea of political representation that you seem to be pointing out. Often refugees are not recognized as representatives of the process of decision making when it comes to programs that the host country authority sort of implements in their societies. Then the third thing is that you said that the learning centers or educational provisions are very well resourced in Indonesia. Could you elaborate a little bit more in the sense that, is it because the refugee population there is very small, and also they are there for a much longer period of time? Well, obviously all refugee settings seem to be quite protracted, right? So they're there for a long period of time, but maybe it's a small. But how are they able to mobilize their network to generate resource to run their learning centers? What is unique about these refugee members of the refugee communities in Indonesia, who have actually managed to generate these support mechanisms? So it would be interesting to hear a little bit, so that we can perhaps try to see what other refugees can potentially do in order to mitigate the challenges around education. So these are my 3 quick points. You may want to respond quickly, and then I will invite, I can see 4 different hands up here, and in one by one, and then you could respond to those.
Okay, thank you for those. In regards to your first question, it's not an entirely rosy picture. Of course, there's going to be conflict. The conflict doesn't necessarily come from the government, from the Ministry of Education per se. There is obviously tension with host communities. These are very dense urban communities that we find in Indonesia, where there's pretty large Hazara groups or Eritrean groups or Somali groups that are living in them. So of course, when you introduce these displaced populations, there will be tension that arises. Indonesians don't have a word for refugee in Bahasa Indonesia. The word for refugee is the same word as an IDP. Because the refugee population is so small. And I think that's quite telling of how people perceive these foreigners. I think there's also a level of curiosity and intrigue. So you find Hazara communities, for example, learning Bahasa Indonesia quite fluently and being included quite quickly, in fact. From the government side, it's almost as if these refugee learning centers have slipped through the cracks, if you will, and that it's not quite on the government radar yet. Those coordination meetings at the government level have started to talk about refugee education, but a lot of these learning centers are able to operate as foundations or local NGOs. And these groups of refugee education practitioners have found Indonesian partners quite cleverly and operate with Indonesian support. So when I talk about refugee education practitioners, it's not just refugee educators, it's a lot of Indonesian educators as well. So yes, I hear about conflict. It's being reported to me. Is it to a degree where it has become violent or the government is stopping people from operating their centers? No, I haven't heard of that yet. And in fact, the government is now well aware of these centers operating. It's because they operate as a non-formal center, I think, is why they're not quite on the radar of the government.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the legal cultural recognition and the political representation. There are a lot of these dynamics are happening within the different community nationality groups that I speak to. The community representatives are from the Afghan community, from the Iranian community, from the Somali community, and a lot of that decision making is being shared between nationalities, and they're very cognizant and very conscientious of one group coming out a bit stronger than others. It even boils down to, for example, you can feature one group more on social media than others, for example. You featured several Iranians last month. No, you cannot. You have to now distribute it more evenly with other national groups. In terms of legal recognition through the states, the legal cultural recognition, that's being, it's not legally binding in the sense that the groups are able to operate here, the learning centers are able to operate, but there's no law in place for these centers to operate. There is a presidential decree that came out in 2019. So we're seeing sort of the baby steps towards this legal cultural recognition. And in terms of the resourcing of the learning centers, not all of them are resourced. And of the 6 centers that I've gone through in Jakarta and Bogor, there is a pretty strong, wide range of resources that you'll see. The refugee population here, I would argue, is a small population. They're relatively well educated. A lot of them were teachers in countries before they came to Indonesia. But it's really the level of resourcefulness that you find, that they're mobilizing through different groups that they wouldn't traditionally have fundraised through. So they're fundraising through like different church groups in Indonesia. They're fundraising through their diaspora groups, as I said. They're using social media. I mean, I follow a dozen refugee groups in Indonesia alone, and they're posting every day. And I think it speaks to the age group here, as well as their level of education, as well as their resourcefulness and their ability to tap into different partnerships and diaspora groups.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Laetitia. That's great. So I'm going to take 4 questions because I'm conscious of time.
Yes.
So if you could respond briefly, we've got about 10 minutes thereabout. So I'm going to invite first Sadaf, then Diego, Vanita, and then Yusuf. Or maybe Vanita, if you need to go first. I think you mentioned that you need to dash off. So would you like to ask your question, and then I'll come to others?
Thank you very much, Tejendra. Laetitia, great presentation. Congratulations. Lovely to hear your explanations. So my question was, and you answered it partly, how do the educationists and the refugee learners themselves sort of deal with their detractors? And there must be many, as Tejendra pointed out, because of the resistance to sort of housing refugees in Indonesia. What kind of communication messages do they send to their detractors, and how do they deal with it? Thank you. Over.
Okay, so Sadaf, thank you, Vanita. Yeah, Sadaf.
Yeah, Tejendra, I have got quite a few questions, but again, conscious of the time. I relate to your experience, Laetitia, because when you said like you were restricted for the online research only, In 2005, when I was visiting Jakarta, Indonesia, so for Banda Aceh, they didn't allow me the visa, although it's part and parcel of the country. So here it brings me to the question here, and as you said, like the refugees are composed of Hazaras, Iranians, Somalis, and people from Banda Aceh. So yeah, it does make sense. Probably they are forming the group, but I do not understand like why do they not want to go for the formal education system, because Banda Aceh is the part and parcel of Indonesia. And so secondly, they are housed, the refugees generally are in Bogor and Jakarta. Bogor is a small city, and as far as I remember, it has only a very beautiful botanical garden, but it's a small city. So in terms of earning livelihood and all that, so it makes sense that people or refugees would stay in Jakarta, but I do not understand why in Bogor. Does it mean that are they designated areas for the refugees there, maybe camps or something, or what attracts them to that small city? Because it's yeah, and yeah, you partially answered it, like, because I wanted to know when they want to homeschool or they want to educate their children in those community centers. So how do they go for the credentials, which you said like they are studying proper curriculums from all that. But I just want to know, how do they appear? How do they earn the credentials? How would they, if they, because it's 10 years or more, or if we don't know, because in these cases we don't know. So what are their plans for the credentials? How do they go for the state exams? Do they go for the O levels or something like the way we have the Cambridge International Examinations or all over the world and all that? Or
Yeah.
how do they opt for those things? Because yeah, they do need, obviously we do need it, proper credentials for all this. So
That's right.
yes.
Yeah.
So these
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
So there's a great 3-4 questions. Hope Laetitia, you've managed to take note of them. Diego.
Hello, everyone. I have 2 quick questions. Laetitia, what do you think would have been different if Indonesia would have signed the Refugee Convention? What do you think would have been different for the refugees? And my second question relates to what you mentioned earlier. You said it takes about 10 years and it's a transition country, and it takes about 10 years for these refugees to move to other countries. And I was just wondering, wouldn't it be better to have the refugees, the guests, learn in the local language, given that they spend about 10 years in that country?
Okay.
And so I was wondering, you mentioned that they use the Australian curriculum, for example, and they studied in English. So I was wondering, would that not be harmful for them, given that the length of time that they stay in the country, in the host country?
Perfect question.
Thank you very
Diego.
much.
Yeah, thank you. Very specific, interesting questions. Yusuf, finally.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now. Yeah, don't move, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, go on.
My question is, what implications do you see on the proposed change in the capital? What changes do you see that might have on refugees and refugee education?
Okay.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Right, so you got 5-6 minutes to answer all of those questions.
All right, I'll do my best. I'll do my best. So just to clarify, Sadaf, in Banda Aceh, it's the Rohingya population. So they're predominantly in the national education system, but I'm not looking at that population, so I don't know exactly the circumstances there. Refugees in Bogor don't earn a livelihood. Actually, refugees in Indonesia are not allowed to be working, but there is a loophole where there's a little gray area, which refugees are now very cleverly tapping into, because as long as they have an Indonesian business partner, they can sell things online. And so they're going back to Instagram and using social media to sell their different products and goods and services. If you want Iranian food, if you want to get Afghan snacks, if you want to get different ceramics made by Afghan women's groups, you can buy it on Instagram or whatever service, and they often have an Indonesian business partner. So it's very, very clever and resourceful. There are no camps in Indonesia. there used to be detention centers, but those have been largely removed, eliminated. And what attracts them to Bogor? Well, Bogor has a really nice climate. And what I've been told by, it's predominantly Hazara that live there. And what I've been told is that they like the cooler weather than Jakarta. And I guess a couple of Hazara arrived in Bogor and decided, oh, it's not bad here at all. It's very hilly and green. And suddenly you have thousands of Hazaras now living in the outskirts of Bogor, and it's really quite amazing to be there, and you feel like it's like a little Afghanistan. Actually, it's really quite awesome. In terms of the credentials, so the credentials are coming from the general education diploma that's from the US and from Elite Open School, and all of that is online. It's paid for by different groups. UNHCR pays for some of it, IOM pays for some of it, but largely it's coming from donations outside of the country. There are no state exams. They're not doing the state exams here. To respond to Diego, it's harder for the centers to operate if the signatory would have been signed. It's going to be at least 10 years, but it could be very, very much longer, and there's not going to be resettlement in Indonesia, right? They're not going to be living in Indonesia for the long term. So you're absolutely right. There's this issue of best practice. Learning Bahasa Indonesia, if you're going to be in a country for 10 years, is really useful. And a lot of the centers haven't come to terms with that. So some centers make Bahasa Indonesia a requirement for their students, and some don't. The implications for proposed changes in the capital, I can't speculate, but I have a feeling that there needs to be a little bit better coordination within the government, because at this point, there isn't a government counterpart that everyone knows to go to for refugee work. And I know that sounds kind of amazing, but there is no agency that even registers refugees. There is no agency that counts the number of refugees. That is all outsourced to different international players. And so now that there's a little bit more interest and awareness, perhaps a government body will be created. But again, Indonesia is facing huge learning loss in a country that is just coming out slowly of the pandemic, and it's not really a priority. So as I was responding to gender earlier, it sort of slipped through the cracks, and refugees are able to operate this network quite cleverly and quite exclusively, if you will. I don't know. I guess I'll have to sort of keep track over the next few years what some of those proposed changes in the capital will be. And Vanita, like dealing with their detractors, with people who criticize, it's pretty disheartening actually for a lot of the young refugee practitioners, because we're talking about very young teachers, some of them are 16, 17 years old. They don't necessarily have a lot of senior experience or management. And they're also facing issues of mental health, challenges with their mental health, where they don't know how long they're going to be in Indonesia. And so to face detractors, again, preliminary findings has been quite disheartening for many of them. I'll have to have another conversation with you in a couple of months when I'm a little bit more confident in my data analysis. I hope that answers all of your questions. I really thank you all for listening and engaging. I've enjoyed it a great deal.
No, thank you, Laetitia. Thanks. Wonderful presentation and really interesting questions and your responses. So wish you all the best with your data analysis, and we look forward to seeing you finish your work and graduate.
The scenic route, everyone. Do not be scared of taking the scenic route.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I think I'm following you.
All right, then. So thank you everyone
Call
for
me.
joining the seminar. So again, remember that we have another presentation the last Friday of next month, and we look forward to seeing you there, and wish you all the best wherever you are, and have a lovely weekend. Bye for now.
Thank
you,
you.
Laetitia.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.